do not buy this camera. Maybe buy this camera. Instead, use the smartphone that you probably already have, or buy a cheap, maybe used smartphone, or buy a used mirrorless or DSLR camera, or save up a bit so that you can get a nicer mirrorless or DSLR camera. So let's back up a bit. Okay, what is this? This is a Saneen digital camera, 4K cameras for photography and video, 64 megapixel Wi-Fi touchscreen vlogging camera for YouTube with flash, 32 gigabyte SD card, lens hood, 3000 milliamp hour battery, front and rear cameras, black. That's what this is. And it's not very good. This might make you wonder, what is Saneen? What is this brand that I've never heard of? Well, the exact brand isn't important. In fact, the name Saneen only appears once on the package on a sticker. Other than that, it is completely absent from the packaging, from the device itself, from the documentation. Even the support email has nothing to do with Saneen. You could probably buy this exact camera from a lot of different brands. It's just some generic camera made in some factory, probably in China, rebranded by other companies, probably also in China, at a very low price, just sort of a race to the bottom. I have seen other cameras on Amazon with basically this exact design. I also came across a review on YouTube of a camera with some significant differences, but it was a very similar price, and I noticed some surprising similarities. Even though it had a flip-out articulating screen, similar to a lot of my Lumix cameras, like this G95, very nice. It had an articulating screen, but the firmware, the interface, the behaviors that I could see on camera were very similar to this. And so I bet that a lot, or perhaps all, of the cameras in this rough price bracket that are just, shoveled out by generic no-name companies might just be the same camera under the hood, the same firmware, and just repackaged a little bit. So what I found in this review is probably going to apply to a lot of them. And I can say that with pretty good confidence, because what makes a smartphone actually better quality than this is not the fact that it's a smartphone. It's the fact that the company behind the smartphone, maybe it's Apple, maybe it's Google, maybe it's Motorola or OnePlus, all of these companies have a decent amount of history and of experience designing the optical characteristics, designing the image processing, sourcing the parts, and collaborating with other companies. OnePlus is famously collaborated with Hasselblad on some of their phones. Those things actually have value when you just throw a lens in front of a sensor and don't really think about the processing and don't worry about massaging the focus experience to be usable. This is what you end up with, and it's not very good. And that's why the recommendation is use your smartphone if you have one, or buy a smartphone if you don't have one, or buy a used DSLR. All of those will get you the image processing pipeline from a much more sophisticated and much more experienced company than whoever made this. I guarantee you Saneen didn't do any meaningful amount of tuning to this. Now, this method of rebadging cheap products, it works sometimes, and there are legitimately products that are perfectly fine. I would say perhaps more than fine, that follow this product paradigm. There are a lot of things that, you don't need a name brand, and you can save quite a bit of money going that route. Cameras are a lot more complicated. I would not trust a no-name brand camera unless there was a lot of testing behind it, actually demonstrating that it can compete in any meaningful sense with the alternatives. But okay, let's be fair to it. What are some positives? What does this camera do well? Well, it kind of feels like a camera. That's good. It has, I would say, a more ergonomic shooting position than the Lumix G100, which I find quite uncomfortably small. It uses USB-C for charging. that's something that some of my other cameras don't do. They are old enough designs that they still use micro USB. It also has a big screen, and the battery life is pretty okay. That's the good stuff about this camera. Okay, so let me take you on a little tour of the camera. Okay, so first of all, we've got two lenses. It's a dual camera. It's kind of weird. It comes with a front lens cap, even though the front element is not particularly interesting. It's just a flat piece of maybe glass. Also, the front element, or the lens, looks a lot smaller in person than it does in the photos. Speaking of differences, I was kind of bummed that the camera that it goes across the front of the device is a lot darker than I expected. Online it looks like a white text, kind of like Lumix on my G95, one of my G95s. But no, it's just dark gray and really subtle and all that. And there's a little lens up there. I'm going to call this world-facing and user-facing. Okay, up top you've got a power button. That's a little weird. Also kind of weird. It says welcome in a serif font. Has a little startup chime. And then you've got a shutter button. Half press to focus. And then click to take the photo. You've got a flash pop-up button. That's just a bunch of LEDs. It's not a very sophisticated flash. It's the same kind of flash as what you have in your phone, except there's more LEDs. Cool. Also, it has no awareness of whether the flash is up or down. So, here's a fun thing. You can switch it to flash on while it's closed. Look at that. And flash off. It's off. Wow. Let me show you that again. Boop. Yeah, that's weird. It's got an exposure compensation dial, although the amount that it changes does not match my other cameras. It might be thirds of stop of exposure compensation. It's a lot less than one, though. Over on the left, we have a lot of different modes. These are needlessly specific, and also the icons are hard to read. Also, it is quite slow responding to changes, so let's change it. Auto. Change it again. It's kind of delayed. Kind of hard to rely on. Also, just these dials are all plastic. They're not very satisfying. And look at how easily they can be twisted. Meanwhile, on a fairly cheap but real mirrorless camera, that's satisfying. And you really have to get into it if you want to turn it with one hand. Or one finger. Or a hand and a finger. I don't know what you would call that. Actually, let's take a look back at the lens. I forgot to show you some things. Look at that. CMOS camera digital zoom. Uppercase f equals 2.4 millimeters. Lowercase f equals 5.04 millimeters. Macro! 52 millimeter. Now 52 millimeter is the filter thread. Also the number printed on the interior of the lens cap. That's a common practice. It is actually threaded, and I bet you could put filters on it, but then again, you could also get a filter kit for a smartphone. Anyway, digital zoom lens 16x. Here's the thing. There's nothing about the lens that impacts digital zoom. It's just cropping in on the image. So they just wanted to have more text to put on the lens to make it look more legit. Because, for example, your typical camera lens has a bunch of specs on it. But these are actual specs, you know, the aperture, the zoom range, filter threads, other specifications. It's aspherical, has power OS, blah, 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 blah. This doesn't have useful specs, so they don't print anything on there. Speaking of not having useful specs, it also doesn't save any EXIF data. Actually, it turns out it does save EXIF data, but it saves it in an old format that's not recognized by Windows Photos, but is recognized by EXIF tool. So we can find some interesting things in the EXIF data. First of all, the aperture value and shutter speed value fields do not match the aperture and shutter speed fields. They're off by quite a bit. This is quite unusual. My phones and the Kodak report those value fields, but they report them very similarly or identical to the non-value fields. The Lumix cameras just don't record those value fields. So throughout this review, I will present the aperture and shutter speed fields, as I think those are going to be more accurate, which are also identical to the f-number and exposure time fields. Another interesting thing in the EXIF data, the aperture appears to be fixed. I always see a 1.4 aperture value and a 2.6 aperture / f-stop. So it looks like it's a fixed aperture lens, which makes sense given the size of the optics, which we can tell based on the crop factor. The focal length, 35mm equivalent focal length, field of view, and crop factor are all consistent with each other. However, the real field of view is narrower. It's about equivalent to 24mm on full frame, which gives it about a 10x crop factor. So if we chart all those with the cameras involved in this comparison, we can see that the Saneen has very small camera sensors, somewhere between the Pixel 7 selfie camera and the iPhone 6s selfie camera. We can also superimpose those sensor sizes on top of my full-frame camera, the Lumix X5 2X, to just get an idea of how it scales. We can also do that to the Lumix G100, representing the Micro Four Thirds sensor size, and even Micro Four Thirds, which, as the name implies, is quite small by interchangeable lens standards. It's way bigger than the Saneen and than the iPhone 6s as well. Rear controls. So you've got T and W to control the digital zoom. You've got a button to switch cameras, which it sometimes crashes when it's doing that. I think it might have just crashed while doing that. Yeah, it's probably going to reboot in a bit, and then it'll be back. You're starting to get the idea that this isn't a very high-quality product. I'm sure it's nothing. Hey, look at that. Wow, it's the user-facing camera. What a curious feature. Hello? Go ahead and switch. That's more like it. So that's what it's supposed to do. Okay, then you got the flash control, Wi-Fi control, OK button, something, self-timer, I guess, which is weird because some of these are also some of the modes seem to have the self-timer, so that might only be active. This is also a D-pad. There's a menu, not a lot of options here, and playback, which is weirdly laid out. But the important thing, how did the images look? Not good. Right out the box, I just took some pictures at my desk just to get a quick feel for it. Now the Saneen saves pictures as 64 megapixels right out the box. The iPhone saves them as 12 megapixels right out the box. Unfortunately, in order to get to 64 megapixels, the Saneen just straight up makes up a ton of detail. So when you actually zoom into 100%, you see a ton of just weird artifacts. Stuff that would show up on the iPhone as, well, you're just zooming past what we actually collected detail for, and so it actually looks authentic and just low detail instead of the Saneen where it's super over-sharpened and processed and just looks really weird. More importantly, the autofocus for the Saneen is just awful. It misses all the time. Okay, so I took a bunch of these cameras to the park and just took some photos. One of the things that I noticed reviewing the photos is that the Saneen has a really weird way of interpreting colors. It makes the grass look kind of dead, but also makes the sky kind of saturated. It's really weird. Pretty much all of the other cameras are in agreement that those colors out of the Saneen are just completely wrong, so I have a lot more confidence in those. And yeah, the Saneen just looks really weird. The Kodak kind of has somewhat similar colors, certainly more similar than the other cameras, but even there, the grass looks greener on the Kodak. And importantly, the Saneen just smears all over the place. It's obviously not a 64 megapixel sensor. This is particularly likely considering the coarseness of the noise that's introduced when you manually set a high ISO. Either that, or it's an embarrassingly bad 64 megapixel sensor. Realistically, it's probably a much lower resolution image sensor that it just is upsampling to 64 megapixel. And the way that it's doing that looks really terrible. You can especially see it in the asphalt, where it doesn't make any sense. You zoom in enough and it starts to look like AI generated, but also like low quality AI generated because it's a low quality camera. The digital zoom that it offers, first of all, digital zoom is really just cropping in on the image. So we're starting with a fake 64 megapixel image anyway, so when you zoom in, you just are focusing more on lower detail stuff. And so it's not useful. Another weird thing about the zoom is it doesn't actually zoom in on the center, which is like what every other zoom does. It zooms in a little above center. Also, it just straight up lies to you about how much it's zoomed in. It claims to go up to 16x, but where it says 16x, it's actually more like 4x, which is not very impressive. This Kodak, its really standout feature is that it has 40x optical zoom. Now, it's not an amazingly high-quality sensor. It's not an amazingly high-quality lens. It's a pretty compact, cheap camera. But it actually has optical zoom. And it can actually render a lot more detail way out in the distance, even though it's a 20-megapixel camera. In fact, the Lumix G95 that I've been bringing into frame every now and again, the kit lens here is a 12 to 60 millimeter on micro four thirds, which gives it more optical zoom range than the Saneen has digital zoom range. And of course, optical zoom range actually gets you more details, so it actually matters. With an interchangeable lens camera, you can also get other lenses for it. So you can get, say, the 14 to 140, which, if you do the math, that's a 10x optical zoom range, which is quite a lot for an interchangeable lens. Again, the Kodak is 40x, which is bonkers. And basically, you only find that kind of zoom range on a fixed lens, point-and-shoot style camera. Now, my Pixel 7 actually has a 50 megapixel sensor, and it can use that to get a 2x crop. And that cropping in 2x actually gets you more detail than the Saneen. In fact, iPhone 6S, you zoom in on that little pavilion thing, and yeah, the Saneen doesn't actually render any more meaningful detail. The moral of the story is a 12 megapixel iPhone is competing in terms of the amount of detail that it can resolve far away. So what purpose does this serve? Okay, taking some pictures of an insulated water bottle with my closet in the background, we can see that the bokeh out of this is pretty weak. It's less than the Pixel 7 without any portrait mode processing. Just straight optically, the Pixel 7 generates more bokeh. Of course, you know, a full camera, even with the kit lens at 12 millimeters, f4.5, that still looks like more bokeh than the Saneen, and it suffers from that weird sharpening processing in the out of focus areas that makes it look pretty weird. If you're trying to get object separation, this is not the way to do it. Now, the Saneen has a user-facing camera, which seems like it's begging for me to take selfies with it. This is an area where the iPhone 6S kind of struggles. Shooting it handheld, it's kind of hard to get an actually stable shot. Now, when I put it on a tripod so that it's nicely stabilized, then I can get a decent shot out of it. The Saneen's user-facing camera is not very good with detail. For some reason, though, if I get it pretty close, where it's mostly just photographing my beard, it gets quite a lot of detail. And it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't behave like it's a fixed focus lens, but for some reason, and we'll talk more about this a little later, it really struggles to focus, like, all the time. The world-facing camera, so the one that looks all big and official, that does have more detail than the iPhone, but the skin tones are completely wild. The Pixel 7's front-facing or user-facing camera is about the same level of detail, but the colors are a lot better. And of course, the G95 just blows out the whole scale, even with the kit lens at 12 millimeters. If you really wanted to wow with the bokeh and whatnot, you'd be using the 25mm f1.7, but just the kit lens, better results, much better detail. Okay, the Saneen mentions vlogging in the product page, so I did a little test. The Saneen was super shaky, the autofocus is completely unusable, the manual focus is useless, and it doesn't actually resolve that much detail. Now let's go more into the focus. So right out the box, it just wants to use autofocus, and it's really bad. For video, you can set it to manual focus. I'm using air quotes because what it actually means is you half press the shutter button to focus, and then you fully press the shutter button to start recording. It doesn't actually let you focus at all. This right here, it's ridged like it is a focus wheel, but it is not. It's just part of the lens. And there's no other way for you to control the focus distance. You can just half press and hope that it gets it. And when I tried that for the vlogging, it didn't. So the best footage I got was with the wild, super hunting autofocus. And even when it's in focus, it doesn't have a lot of detail. Now, the Pixel 7, I ended up having it set to 1080p when I ran this test, so the detail isn't as good as it probably could be, but it's in focus, and it's well stabilized, and I would absolutely take a vlog with the Pixel 7 over the iPhone or the Saneen. I didn't try with the Kodak because I wanted a lens facing the same direction as a screen, which the G95 can do with the articulating screen. And yeah, of course, it blows everything else out of the water. It has a lot more detail. It's well stabilized. The autofocus, which I never use for video because it's contrast based and it hunts quite a bit, but even there, it's still better than the Saneen. It's a lot more stable, and when it hunts a little bit, and then it gets back into focus. Not so with the Saneen. And let me show you how manual focus is supposed to work with a camera. So we've got it set like this. Right now it's an autofocus, so you have to press the shutter button to focus in a variety of places. If we switch it to manual focus, that doesn't work, but let's get rid of the lens hood. You can rotate the focus wheel to adjust where it focuses, or you can just tap the AF button to one-shot activate the autofocus. And by default, all these Lumix cameras, when you switch it into manual focus, you get this nifty little focus peaking so that you can tell what's in focus. And I'm using that to monitor several of these different camera angles that I have going on. You can even customize it to use a specific FN button to activate focus. So I've set it to this button right up here. So I can just focus, 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 focus. And you notice how quick it's beeping because it's actually a competent autofocus system. It's contrast based, yes, but it's quick and it's quite usable for photos. Now, one other limitation of the G95, however, for vlogging is the kit lens goes out to 12 millimeters, which would work, except It crops in quite a bit at 4K, so if you're actually going to vlog with a camera like this, you really should get a wider angle lens. If I were doing it, I would use this 9mm f1.7 that I've gotten for a separate reason. It's about a $500 lens though. So for general video purposes, well, I shot some test footage of me playing the piano, as well as a similar shot to what my S5 IIX is recording right now, just sort of a talking head style shot, except I wasn't talking. Now, the Kodak, I did test it here. Yeah, it's pretty rough. It only records 1080p video, and it's not very good 1080p video. It's pretty rough. Yeah. Now, the Saneen is really smeary. There's not a lot of detail. I don't see a whole lot of noise in the image, but that's just because it's aggressively processing it out and wiping away a ton of detail along with it. It also by default has a timestamp imprinted into the video, and it'll adjust whether that's in white or black text based on the background, but I found that it will sometimes thrash between white and black, and so it'll flash between it really quick. So they didn't really think that through very well. The iPhone 6S can record 4K, but it's not very good. It's pretty noisy, and there's not a whole lot of real detail there. The Pixel has decent detail. It still looks quite over-sharpened, but a big step up from the iPhone 6S, and I would take it over the Saneen. Now, naturally, the G95 is a lot better. However, indoors, the G95s struggle with noise, so I'm shifting my setup to use brighter lenses on the G95s as well as the G100, which uses a very similar sensor. For example, I have this 14mm f2.5 tiny little lens. It's like the smallest autofocus capable lens for Micro Four Thirds. It's about $200. And when you put a brighter lens on the G95, yeah, it cleans up the footage a whole lot. Naturally, you can get even nicer footage if you get like an S5 IIX or a GH6, but they're a lot more expensive, like over 10 times the price compared to the Saneen, so completely different scale. Now, just for kicks, I compared it to my Dashcam, which is Vantru N4 Pro. It has a much wider angle lens, but even accounting for that, the Saneen actually does look better. Again, as long as you can actually get things in focus. So let's talk about the focusing system. So it misses a lot. And like in situations where it's a very simple scene, I'm just pointing it at my keyboard, say, and it beeps, it shows green, I take the photo and I review it, and it's like, this is not at all in focus. This looks terrible. And when you're reviewing photos in the camera, you can't always tell whether it's in focus or not. You can kind of zoom in, but only up to like 170%, and then it's really pixely anyway. So you basically have to go back to a computer in order to tell whether or not you got focus. I had a particularly terrible example of that at the park where I took a bunch of photos, I think at a claimed 4x zoom, which realistically is less than 2x. And every shot I tried at that zoom level, it was just completely obviously out of focus. What I think it was doing is I half pressed it to focus and it locked in, and then right as I was pressing it the rest of the way to take the photo, I think it was adjusting the focus some more. So it had focus, and then it moves out of focus to try to refocus. But like the scene wasn't really changing at all. So why was it doing that? It doesn't make any sense. So in addition to that, it gives you no control over how it focuses. With like every alternative, you have some control over how it focuses. There's plenty of customization on the G95s and other Lumix cameras and other name brand cameras. On phones, you can just tap where you want to focus, and it'll focus there. And on phones, a lot of them these days have phase detect autofocus or laser-based autofocus or some kind of sophisticated autofocus system so that it can actually track meaningfully. And this is an aspect in which phones are actually better than a lot of cameras. The only camera that I have that has phase detect autofocus is the S5 IIX, my G95s, and my GH6. and of course the G100, are all contrast based. And that means that when you try to use it for video, it's practically guaranteed to hunt quite a bit. So the Saneen is clearly a contrast-based autofocus system, but it's way worse than the ones that are in my Lumix cameras. Because my Lumix cameras, I can at least rely on for standard, everyday photography scenarios. Like, I can use autofocus for that. But if the autofocus doesn't work on the Saneen, you don't actually have any recourse. You can't set it to manual focus and just adjust the focus manually. You can set it for video manual focus, but it again doesn't really give you any control. You just have to trust that it locks in focus before you start the video, and it doesn't give you good tools to test that. And that's kind of a theme with the Saneen. It doesn't give you any meaningful control. So you might notice there's no way to put this in an aperture priority or a shutter priority, much less a full manual mode. That's something that even the Kodak can do, and some phones can do. Look at that. Program, shutter priority, aperture priority, full manual. And yeah, you can control the shutter speed and the aperture and the ISO on the Kodak. And those are all really important modes if you're trying to learn more about photography and sort of train for a higher end camera down the road. If you have a budding interest in photography, having those modes is actually a meaningful value add over a phone if the phone doesn't have that control. Or maybe even if it does, potentially. So the Saneen doesn't give you that. But what does it give you? Well, you can control the ISO. Which is bonkers. They put it front and center, but like, why would I care? I don't care what ISO you run at. Just run at the lowest ISO you can, given the other parameters. Shutter speed matters for motion blur, and aperture matters for the depth of field, the amount of background separation. Because it already has exposure compensation, -1, +1. Certainly when you get into the mid-range ISOs, bumping up the ISO adjusts other things behind the scenes so that it compensates for that adjustment. I guess it can't put the aperture wide enough to make ISO 100 work in this scenario. So it gives you control over the one thing that you shouldn't have to care about. Oh, by the way, phones also give you exposure compensation or brightness sliders. So that's another area that the Saneen doesn't set itself apart from a smartphone. The exposure compensation, I briefly mentioned this earlier. I think the Saneen might be doing it in third stops. Actually, the exposure compensation is just inconsistent. It's also not actually changing the exposure. When I set a fixed ISO and adjust the exposure compensation, the shutter speed and aperture stay exactly the same. And when it's left to auto ISO, it just changes both the ISO and the shutter speed in opposite directions, just for fun, I guess. So it's not actually changing the exposure of the camera sensor, it's just changing the colors after it exposes the sensor. So this makes it kind of hard to quantify exactly how much it's actually changing the colors in the image due to the exposure compensation dial, but we can get a better idea if we just chart the histograms of these images. That's the frequency of different luminance levels throughout the image. And using these histograms, we can see that most of the time it's close to or less than thirds of stops of exposure change. Once you get to +2 or +3, then it gets to be pretty substantial and gets closer to what an actual +3 exposure should look like. And also, it doesn't give you much range, because on the Lumix cameras, you can go to -5 or +5. Like, you can go crazy with the exposure compensation. Probably more than you should, but you can do it. Also, it has a mount up there, right, that looks like you could maybe mount a flash there. Has a little blank. This is interesting. It doesn't actually lock in. You can just slide it out. And wow, look at that, no contacts. So it's a cold shoe. So you can mount accessories to it, but nothing that can actually talk to the camera, which means you can't realistically use external flashes. It also doesn't have like a separate flash port on it. So you can't use external flashes with it. Again, another thing that you might want a standalone camera to be able to do that it cannot do. Let's see, this has fixed lenses. This is something that you might want to use a separate camera for. You know, you can pop off the lens and put whatever you want on there as long as it has a compatible lens mount. You can't do that with the Saneen. Even though it's got this big chungus lens, it's fixed, and it's not very optically impressive. And same thing with the user-facing camera. So you're stuck permanently with an unknown lens, and only one in each direction. A lot of modern smartphones have multiple lenses. My Pixel 7 doesn't have a ton. It just has 2 world-facing cameras and 1 user-facing camera. And that already is more than the Saneen. There are also some quality of life problems. So the screen on the Saneen is around a 16:9 aspect ratio. The photos that it saves are 4:3 aspect ratio, which is the same as a lot of other cameras in this lineup. What's unique about the Saneen is instead of shrinking the image to fit on the screen, it just chops off the top and bottom. And so you look at the image on the screen and you think you're getting a certain image, and then when you play it back, it still chops it off because it's still on the camera. But when you take it back and plug the SD card into your computer and look at it on a bigger screen, you find out, oh, there is actually stuff above and below that it did not show me. This is weird. This is not how you make a camera. Another weird thing that's just different than your typical camera, usually if you half press the shutter button, it'll leave playback mode. Here, even if you fully press the shutter button, it doesn't do anything. You have to go back, and then you're back into record mode. It's just weird. Why are you doing this? Why are you reinventing the wheel? There's another weird thing. There's no internal battery for time. That means if you take out the battery, then it'll reset the time. Now, I haven't actually bothered to set the time on the camera because I don't care. But yeah, if you take it out, it's going to reset the numbering. So it's a good thing that it ships with USB-C capable charging. While we're on the battery door, the layout is pretty similar to the G100. However, unlike the G100, it doesn't actually lock in place in any meaningful sense. It has this little area right here that you're supposed to pull on, but you don't actually have to push down at all. You can just push it sideways and it opens. That's not great. It's a darn good thing that the SD card and the battery are separately held in place, because if they weren't, then they would probably be falling out unintentionally quite a bit. Also, the tripod mount is right next to the base of the battery door. So if this is on a tripod, which it should be because it doesn't have like any meaningful amount of stabilization, especially for video, you're not going to be able to access the battery or the SD card. Speaking of the tripod, this tripod thread is unusually shallow. Like, I screw in some accessories and they just don't go in all the way, where they go on just fine on my other cameras. It's really weird. So it uses an SD card. It ships with a 32 gig card. That's kind of nice. It uses FAT32 formatting, which one of the notable limitations is that FAT32 only supports up to 4 gigabytes per file. And so when you're recording 4K, it has to record in separate chunks, which is just annoying to deal with if you record for long periods of time. It does record continuously through that time, and it seems to record quite a while. But it's just more work when you go to edit it. Also, the SD card has a weirdly raised label. You can see it started to peel up because the label got caught on the SD card reader that I usually use. So I started using a different one with a bigger opening. It also has no internal memory for file numbers, so it'll increment the number of the file as long as those files are still on the card. But once you copy the files off the card and delete them, it'll instantly reuse those numbers, which is a problem if you dump a bunch of images into the same folder, because now you're going to get collisions where you have to manually rename them or put them in separate files. None of my other cameras do that. They keep an internal record of what the last number was, and they just keep incrementing it that way. It ships with a lens hood. However, the way that it attaches to the camera is just with rubber in the filter screw, which is a real bummer, because one of the convenient things that you should be able to do with a lens hood is fix it to the lens backwards for storage. You can't do that on this lens. And that's really unusual and really annoying. So let's go over some of the reasons why you might want a separate camera over a smartphone. Maybe you want more control. You want to be able to customize some of the settings, some of the optics that are going on. You can't do that on the Saneen. You get, I would say, less control than on a smartphone. Okay, so that doesn't work. You might want more optical zoom. Well, that doesn't work. This just has a wide-angle lens, a standard wide-angle lens. So a lot of smartphones actually have telephoto lenses that are going to give you more reach. Okay. You might want to be able to customize the lens that's on there. You can't do that here. It's fixed lens. And probably harder to add other lenses on top of it than for a smartphone. They sell lens add-on kits for smartphones that you can use to get some different looks. They'll be of varying quality, but that's a possibility on a smartphone. That's probably harder to do on this. You might want better image quality. Well, this is sometimes better than a 9-year-old iPhone 6S. I didn't find one scenario in which I would take it over the Pixel 7, a recent flagship. So if you have a reasonably modern phone, you're probably already getting better pictures. Maybe you want it for ergonomics. Okay, this is something that the Saneen arguably does kind of do. But if you're really after ergonomics, get a used DSLR. Or get the Kodak. This is a capable little camera. It's not much more expensive than the Saneen, but it gives you a 40x optical zoom range. It has image stabilization. I haven't been amazed with it, but it has reasons for existing. If you need a lot of reach, or if you want to start tinkering with some manual modes, you can actually do that on the Kodak. So this makes a lot more sense to exist. Now, one reason that maybe these cheap cameras could justify their existence is you buy it for a kid so that they can just go around and take photos. And yeah, the quality doesn't matter that much. But if you have the kind of money to buy this, just buy a cheap smartphone and naturally lock it down as much as you see fit. Or buy a used DSLR. You can get cheap DSLRs for a similar price on eBay, and that'll just give you better image quality, better control, and it's a standalone camera. Look at that. The thing that I could see justifying the existence of cheap cameras for kids is fun designs. And yeah, I looked at the Saneen store, and they do actually have some other cameras with more interesting designs. That's a lot cheaper. That's $10. That's definitely not going to be very good. But if you're getting a camera for a kid, yeah, maybe they'll have fun with this. And yeah, if you're getting a $10 brand new camera, you should expect the quality to be really bad. Like, way worse than this, probably. So again, if you have an old smartphone that you're not using anymore, maybe you upgraded a while back and you still have your old one, they can shoot photos on that and they'll look better. But of course, if you really want to get into photography or videography, you should really consider getting a proper standalone camera, a mirrorless or DSLR. It'll give you a lot more room to grow, a lot more room to experiment, a lot more room to learn photography principles and how to use the gear and all that stuff. And it'll actually largely get out of your way. For example, the autofocus. It's really bad on the Saneen. If you get a decent camera and yeah, you can use the autofocus for photos and reliably expect that things will be in focus. And as I mentioned earlier, you can get other lenses, an ultra-wide lens, a 9mm lens. You can get a super zoom lens, 10x 14-140, really compact, versatile lens. You can get a long-range telephoto lens, this 100-300. Isn't that fun? Or you can get a macro lens so that you can get some really, really close-up photos. So yeah, the Saneen is not a replacement for a real camera. It's not even a good replacement for a smartphone. If you have a smartphone, you probably have a better camera. Just use that, enjoy it, and save up some more money until you can get a more meaningfully upgraded camera setup. I have not been able to find a single scenario in which the Saneen camera makes any sense. And I didn't even go really hard on the false advertising aspects. It says it's 64 megapixel. Well, that's technically true. It just has a terrible amount of detail, like maybe 12 megapixel level of detail. It says 16x digital zoom. That's like straight up false. It does not have that much digital zoom, and even if it did, it can't actually do anything meaningful with that. Moral of the story, don't buy it. It's a waste of resources, doesn't make any sense for existing. Unless I've missed something, if you can think of some scenario in which this might make sense, keeping in mind all of the samples that I've actually shot with this camera, then, well, sound off in the comments. I'll be curious to see what you have to say. But that's it from me. Go drink some water, and don't buy this. Okay, I'll talk at you later.